to another Trial Site News interview. I'm your host, Brandon, and today we'll be talking to Wayne Rohde, author of the book, The Vaccine Court 2.0, The Dark Truth of America's Vaccine Injury Compensation Program. Mr. Rohde is also a member of the vaccine injury group called React 19. The topic of today's discussion is HHS plans to publish a proposed COVID-19 Countermeasure Injury Table in November 2026 under the current Countermeasures Injury Compensation Program, or what's known as CICP, which could dramatically change the criteria for potential compensation. Mr. Rohde, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Brandon. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you.
Can we start with the proposed COVID-19 Countermeasure Injury Table that's to be released in November? Why is this happening, but why wait until November?
Well, first off, the CICP, the Countermeasures Injury Compensation Program, back in August of 2021, adopted the smallpox vaccine injury table as kind of like their standard proof. And with that, there was myocarditis and all the cardiac associated medical ailments from that. So they use that to kind of help start processing the petitions for compensation. But it became quickly known that we've had many other medical conditions that needed to be addressed. The Secretary of HHS back then charged the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Mathematics, it's known as the old IOM, to look at all the medical literature and to see if there's anything else that could be addressed. And in April of 2024, they came out with a report. And the report, which I was very critical of, but not because they came out with the report, but they said that myocarditis is a very common ailment. We need to look at it. But the report was something that was incomplete in my mind, because in their rush to look at the literature, they had to do a cutoff, and that cutoff generally says by the beginning of 2023, that was the end of what they had to look at. So there's a lot of science that's happened, papers and have been published since the beginning of 2023. That's not included in this report. So what the report came out was saying, hey, myocarditis, everything else, there's not really anything there. So it kind of misled the government and the communities of like React 19 and everyone else, and said, well, it's just, if it's not myocarditis, then we really don't recognize it as an injury. But we know that it's there, and it's very, very prevalent. So we thought that we should have an additional work done on an injury table. By then, we've had an election in November of 2024. Things changed, and we were hoping that we would actually get to where we're going to have some elementary change, because the previous Secretary of HHS refused to adopt the report. The Secretary of HHS, Becerra, could have adopted the report and said myocarditis is a known medical condition. Well, it was just so prevalent that we'd really, that everybody knew that. So now we have Secretary Kennedy, and for a lot of people, those who have been injured by the COVID vaccine, were hoping that we could be recognized for some of these other injuries. And what's crazy is that we're starting to see a lot of injuries that are very bizarre. They're very complicated, and they're not what we call stable, meaning with traditional vaccines, generally, if you develop an injury, such as seizures, whatever, it remains, you have a seizure disorder. But with the COVID vaccine, a lot of the injuries are changing. And what do I mean by that is that These people will have medical conditions, and it becomes very difficult to diagnose what they have because every few months something else has changed, and it's really crazy what's happening here. So it's difficult for those who have been injured to get a proper diagnosis. The push here to get something is a table that's much needed. The issue is that we need to have it scientifically verifiable, meaning it's you just can't pull a medical condition out of the air and say this is what this person has without some type of credible science behind it. So that's what is being happening now. Kennedy is actually doing the work that the National Academy of Science should have been doing, and others agencies that should have been doing. And he's going to try to put together a table. Now, there's going to be critics of that push, if you will, those who don't believe there's injuries from the COVID vaccine. Big Pharma will try to prevent some of this from happening, but it needs to be done. And it's the first step to getting proper compensation for those who have been injured, but also proper diagnosis and treatment protocols for those who have been injured. And that's why you see this push. And but there's a protocol to do it. You have to set a date, and then you have a public comment period afterwards, and then you make the decisions what to adopt and what not to adopt for COVID vaccine injury. Um, Now, some people say, well, why November? Well, to me, it takes time to put this thing together. Now, other people say, well, let's wait and he'll put it in after the midterm elections. Well, that's a political decision. Maybe, maybe not. I don't think there's much of that there, as much as it takes time to find credible science to support these types of medical conditions. That's what I believe is really what it is.
Can you walk us through the current limitations of the CICP for COVID-19 vaccine claims and
Yeah,
explain
this
to explain how adding a specific injury table would change the compensation process for claimants?
uh, the CICP, and I was on record with Congress way back over a decade ago that the Countermeasures Injury Compensation Program was never designed for long-term pandemic nationwide public health emergencies. It was always designed when it was first formed and passed into law in 2010 to be more of a regional issue, maybe to deal with disease outbreaks from a hurricane or earthquakes or wildfires or even short-term pandemics. The swine flu of 2009 was a kind of a regional thing. And so that's what it was designed for. But when COVID came around, it really just we really saw the curtain was pulled away, and you could really see the shortcomings and the limitations of this program. One is that it's really an administrative process. There's no judicial appeal process. It's like filing a claim in the black hole. You know, you have the right to file and lose. That's really where we are at with this. The statute of limitations from the date of the administration of the countermeasure, and it's not just vaccines, but for COVID, it's vaccines, antivirals, um, the medical devices, whatever. The date you receive that vaccine or antiviral, you have 1 year to file a petition. Now, the way we treated most people when they got the vaccine, we were in a very big hurry. People were going through drive-through clinics and everything. Where there was no informed consent, so people didn't know about their options if they did develop an injury to file. So The vast majority of people who are injured could not file. They didn't know that they had only 1 year to file. The MVICP, or what we call the vaccine court, you have 3 years from the first onset of symptoms to file, or 2 years from the date of death. So the big one is the statute of limitations. Other limitations are there's no pain and suffering benefit. There is a death benefit. Big deal for the person that dies. I mean, the family gets a death benefit. Um, no legal fees or medical expert fees are reimbursed. So it's basically you versus submitting the petition against the Secretary of HHS. What these compensated awards that are being given out, and there's been a few since the beginning, is basically unreimbursed medical expenses. So if you're seriously injured, you lost your job, you're about ready to lose your home, and you submit a petition because you can no longer walk, you can't function correctly, they send you a check back for $4,000 saying, "Hey, this is what your insurance didn't pay for, so we'll pay you for that." That's it. That's really not compensation. It's unreimbursed medical expenses. And that's the shame of this program. It's not designed to take care of those who have been truly injured. It's an abomination of what we should be doing as a nation. Other countries actually step up and compensate the injured from their citizens. We don't.
What specific injuries or conditions do you believe should be presumed to be caused by COVID-19 vaccines to be added to this table?
Well, I think what you're going to see is there's a whole host of cardiac uh, uh, medical conditions, all related, um, from stroke all the way to heart attacks, to myocarditis, inflammation of the heart, things like that. That's the big one. But also some neurological injuries such as Guillain-Barré, transverse myelitis, and a few others from there. Um, it's real tricky with autoimmune disorders because a lot of them take a long time to manifest themselves or develop. So the statute of limitations is going to be a problem. Um, and there's ways of getting around that. I think we're going to see with this new legislation coming in. But then earlier, I just released on my Substack, the vaccinecourt.substack.com, an article about, and I've got to read this here because it's a long medical term, it's called thrombosis with thrombocytopenia syndrome, TTS. And there's a few other related medical conditions of that. Basically, blood clotting or issues developing, whether or not blood platelets are developing naturally. And it's very painful. These are starting to become more prevalent. Now, in the CICP, there's only been 4 decisions in favor of what we call TTS. But if you look at the output from HRSA regarding pending applications, there are dozens of claims of TTS. And this, I think, is an emerging medical condition. But you have death, naturally has to be there, myocarditis or other related cardiac events, neurological events, or medical conditions such as Guillain-Barré, transverse myelitis, CIDP, things like that are associated, and others. And now TTS, and then they have a new one called vaccine-induced thrombotic thrombocytopenia, which is very similar to TTS. Um, that's a wide spectrum of those who have been injured that we know of.
So HHS was legally required under the PrEP Act to establish this injury table from the start,
Right.
yet it appears it took a lawsuit, recent lawsuit, filed in May from Ray Flores and Erica Samp to force action. So do you view this timeline as genuine reform or a response to litigation pressure?
I think it's a little bit of both, but you have to remember that the White House has kind of put some pressure on Kennedy not to do certain things, talk about because of the upcoming elections. But Secretary Kennedy is under a lot of pressure to get a lot of things done right, and not only just vaccine related, but everything else that's under his umbrella, such as food supplies and things like this, disease control, and it's a big job. And unfortunately, previous secretaries of HHS have been ignoring a lot of these things. Now, one of the problems that we have here is that you have a statute that's uh, that was written by Congress back in 2010. For him to do certain things, he can only, he's adding the table, which he has the authority to do so, and he has to follow certain protocol from there. But to change other parts of it is going to require Congress to do some things and they have shown no appetite to really do anything in the last 15, 20 years in regards to any of these programs. And that's a shame, but hopefully that'll be done. And that's where we see this new legislation that's being introduced.
The bipartisan Doggett-Smucker bill, the Vaccine Injury Compensation Modernization Act of 2026, is called the most significant proposed reform of the U.S. vaccine injury compensation system in decades. Separate from the HHS rulemaking, how do these two reforms interact, and could one undercut or accelerate the other depending on which moves first?
Yeah. The bill, I believe it's HR 9672 is the number. Representative Lloyd Doggett out of Austin, Texas, and a Democrat and Republican Representative Smucker out of Pennsylvania have been working on this. Now, there's been previous attempts to modify. Most of this bill actually deals with reforming the MVICP, not the CICP, but reforming the MVICP and changes. And I've outlined many of these changes years ago in my first book, The Vaccine Court. The number of special masters need to be increased. We have a backlog right now, about 3,400 cases in the MVICP. The CICP has a backlog, maybe about 14,000 cases, but the CICP doesn't have special masters. It's just an administrative function. So some people are kind of have to understand that the death benefit and pain and suffering need to be raised. In my opinion, this bill says that they're going to raise it to $600,000 for the MVICP. My opinion, they need to get to closer to $1 million to keep up with medical inflation and other federal jurisdictions. And also then raise the statute of limitations from 3 years for injury, maybe to 5 to 6. I know that there's been a push going back 20 years to increase the statute of limitations. And Republican Congressman Dan Burton, back in 2003, 2004, and 2005, was pushing for that. Then he finds out that he's going to get primaried, and his own party shut him down from that. It's pharma controls Congress, so that's why I'm kind of concerned about where this is going to go, if it will go at all. But also in this thing is the moving the COVID vaccine injury into the MVICP, which would allow those COVID injuries to be then litigated with the help of an experienced vaccine injury attorney and medical experts. Now, that's tremendous news for those who have been injured. but it also allows for what we call a look back and some provisions that all those who filed in the CICP and were dismissed can refile in the MVICP, which is, it's like getting a mulligan. You get another chance at this, but this time you have an attorney and medical experts to support your claim, not just yourself on a piece of paper. So there's a wonderful, wonderful proposals here. Now, I know there's some pushback from a lot of people in the health freedom movement regarding they don't want this mRNA type technology into the MVICP. I understand that. I have some concerns there too. But the COVID vaccine injured people are severely injured and they need our help. We cannot reform the CICP to a point where it's very on the same level as the MVICP. That would require a lot of issues with Congress, and they show no appetite to do that. One of the big limitations here, though, is the funding. Now, to ask Congress for any money right now is nearly impossible, but it's got to be done. They've also, in the legislation, wanted to increase the tax or levy on per vaccine instead of 75 cents, maybe move it up to $2, $2.50. That would help create the trust fund to increase the trust fund to help pay for these increase in petitions that are going to be filed. My opinion and my projections looking at the economic cost here is that you have 14,000 petitions in the CICP. If there's an announcement and Congress agrees to do all this, I think you're going to see a tenfold or a 20-fold number of people filing. So now you're going to have 150,000, maybe up to 250,000 people will actually file a petition for injury. That doesn't mean they're all credible, but they will. We need to have an infrastructure in the MVICP to handle that, which means we got to hire more special masters and clerks and staff, DOJ attorneys to handle this, and then you got to have the funding. Now, it's going to take 2 to 3 years to build up the trust fund to help compensate. So what I think you're going to see here with a supplement that's not mentioned in the legislation is to ask Congress for a short-term supplement to build up as a one-time fee, maybe 500 million to 750 million to start. So there's a lot of moving parts. There's a lot of things that have to be done. Whether or not it gets done, I don't know.
Wayne Rohde, thank you so much for joining us today.
I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
And for unbiased news and opinion articles and the latest in scientific research, please visit trialsitenews.com.